Pull a frame from a hive that's been running for 5 years, and it looks completely fine. Dark, sure, but structurally solid. Bees walking across it calmly. Brood filling the cells right on schedule. Serious beekeepers look at that exact same frame and see something closer to a slow-motion problem. One that's been quietly building for years, invisible the entire time. And most beginners never learn why until something finally goes wrong. If you want the kind of practical, no-nonsense beekeeping information that actually keeps your hive healthy for the long run, not just this season, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel is built around, every single week. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why comb darkens and changes over time, what that darkening actually means for your colony's health, and the specific rotation system experienced beekeepers use to keep their equipment working for them instead of quietly against them. Let's start with what's actually happening inside that dark, aged comb, because the color change itself is the visible tip of a much bigger biological story most beginners never get told. Fresh, newly drawn wax comb is a pale, almost translucent white or light yellow, and it stays that way for exactly one reason. Nothing has been raised in it yet. The moment a colony starts using a cell to raise brood, that changes permanently. Every single larva that develops in a cell leaves behind a thin cocoon of silk when it pupates, and workers don't remove that cocoon before reusing the cell for the next generation. They simply clean it enough to use again, leaving the old cocoon lining bonded to the cell wall. Layer that process over dozens of brood cycles across multiple years, each one adding another thin film of silk, along with propolis workers apply for structural reinforcement and trace amounts of larval waste, and you get exactly the dark, almost black comb that experienced beekeepers instantly recognize as old. Here's what almost nobody tells beginners about what that buildup actually does, beyond simply changing color. And it's the detail that turns this from a cosmetic curiosity into something worth genuinely managing. Each layer of cocoon silk measurably narrows the interior diameter of the cell, even though the change per cycle is small enough that no single generation would ever notice it happening. A queen raises roughly 7 to 8 brood cycles through a typical season in most climates, and comb left in continuous use for 3, 4, 5 years or more accumulates dozens of these layers, each one shaving a small amount of usable space off the inside of every single cell in that frame. Bees raised in progressively smaller cells come out measurably smaller themselves, generation after generation. And while a single season's difference is subtle enough to be nearly invisible during a routine inspection, the cumulative effect across years of continuous use in unrotated comb produces a noticeably smaller worker bee than the same colony would raise on fresh foundation, smaller wings, smaller overall body size, and by extension, a reduced capacity for the kind of foraging range and nectar-carrying capacity a full-sized worker brings to the colony's productivity. It helps to have a rough visual scale in mind for judging comb age at a glance, since color is genuinely the most accessible clue available during an ordinary inspection without any special tools. Freshly drawn comb that's never held brood stays pale, close to white, or a very light straw yellow. Comb that's raised its first 1 or 2 brood cycles shifts to a light golden or amber tone, still bright enough to see light through if you hold a frame up. By the 2nd or 3rd year of continuous brood use, comb typically deepens into a medium brown, distinctly darker and less translucent. And by year 4 or 5, comb is commonly described as genuinely dark brown to nearly black, dense and opaque enough that you can no longer see any light through the cells at all when held up to a bright sky. That black, opaque stage is the clearest visual signal that a frame has been in service long enough to be a serious rotation candidate, though the underlying narrowing and pathogen accumulation risk is already building well before comb reaches that most extreme, obvious endpoint. There's a second consequence layered on top of the shrinking cell problem, and it's arguably the more serious one, because it's about disease rather than just size. Old comb doesn't just accumulate silk and propolis, it accumulates pathogens too, and this is where the stakes genuinely escalate beyond a slightly smaller worker bee. American foul brood, one of the most serious bacterial diseases a colony can face, produces spores that are extraordinarily hardy, capable of remaining viable and infectious in old comb and equipment for decades under the right conditions, essentially indefinitely for practical beekeeping purposes. A colony that experiences even a mild, resolved case of foul brood, or one that's simply been exposed to spores drifting in from a robbing event or a swap of equipment with another apiary, can leave those spores embedded in the wax itself, sitting dormant and largely undetectable through ordinary visual inspection, waiting for conditions that favor an active outbreak. Comb that's never rotated out essentially becomes a long-term reservoir for exactly this kind of risk, accumulating not just one pathogen's history, but potentially the layered residue of anything the colony has been exposed to across its entire multi-year lifespan. There's a third accumulation problem worth knowing about, and it's one that beekeepers occasionally quietly cause themselves through the very treatments meant to protect their bees. Beeswax is lipophilic, meaning it readily absorbs and holds on to fat-soluble compounds, and that includes the active ingredients in a lot of common mite treatments, particularly some of the older synthetic miticides that were widely used for years before beekeepers had as many organic acid alternatives available. A colony treated repeatedly over several seasons with the same class of synthetic miticide, using comb that's never rotated out, can end up with measurable pesticide residue built up directly in its own brood wax, a slow accumulation from the beekeeper's own well-intentioned mite management, rather than from any external exposure at all. Research into this effect has found detectable levels of various miticide residues in old brood comb from apiaries with a long history of chemical treatment. And while the practical health impact on the colony itself is still an active area of study, it's a genuinely uncomfortable irony worth knowing about. The very frames a beekeeper has been protecting season after season can become a slow-building repository of the protection itself, layered up right alongside everything else old comb accumulates over the years. Here's a scenario that plays out constantly, and it's worth sitting with because it shows exactly why this problem stays invisible for so long. A beekeeper runs the same set of brood frames for years without ever rotating any of them out, because those frames look structurally fine every single time they're inspected. No visible mold, no obvious damage, bees using them productively season after season with no apparent complaint. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, that colony experiences a disease outbreak that a neighboring, newer colony managed to avoid entirely despite facing the same regional disease pressure and similar management otherwise. The beekeeper assumes bad luck or blames a specific management mistake made that particular season, never realizing the actual risk factor was sitting quietly in frames that have been part of the equipment for 5, 6, 7 years, accumulating exactly the kind of pathogen reservoir that made this colony more vulnerable than its newer equipped neighbor from the very start. Stick around, because coming up, I'm going to show you the exact rotation system experienced beekeepers actually use, how much comb to replace, how often, and the specific trick that gets bees to actually draw the new foundation instead of ignoring it in favor of the old, familiar cells. This isn't actually a new problem that only emerged once beekeepers started reusing frames for decades at a time. It's one that older forms of beekeeping solved almost by accident, simply through how those systems were structured. Traditional skep beekeeping, using woven straw baskets rather than removable wooden frames, generally involved either destroying the colony or driving bees out to harvest honey, which meant comb was essentially never kept in continuous use for more than a season or two before the whole structure was rebuilt from scratch by a fresh colony. It wasn't a deliberate disease prevention strategy in the way we'd frame it today, but it had the side effect of naturally resetting comb age far more often than modern frame-based beekeeping does, since the entire premise of the Langstroth-style movable frame, invented specifically to let beekeepers reuse comb efficiently across years without rebuilding it, quietly created this rotation problem as an unintended trade-off for all the genuine convenience and efficiency it otherwise provided. Old-time frame beekeepers who did work with movable comb generally still practiced some form of periodic replacement, even without fully understanding the cell narrowing mechanism the way modern research has since documented it, simply because dark, heavily used comb was widely recognized as more disease-prone through plain observation, well before anyone could explain precisely why in biological terms. Now, here's where it gets genuinely practical, because knowing that old comb is a problem doesn't help much without a concrete system for actually managing it. And this is exactly the piece most beginner resources skip entirely, usually because it feels like an advanced-level topic rather than something worth mentioning early on. The standard rotation guideline most experienced beekeepers work from is replacing roughly a fifth to a third of your brood frames every year, meaning a full cycle through your entire set of brood comb happens somewhere between every 3 and 5 years, which conveniently lines up with exactly the window where the cell narrowing and pathogen accumulation effects we just covered start becoming genuinely meaningful rather than negligible.
Here's how this actually works in practice, because the mechanics matter, and doing it wrong can create more disruption than benefit. Mark your frames, either with a simple written date on the top bar or a color-coded thumbtack system, so you always know at a glance which frames are approaching their rotation year without having to guess or rely on memory across multiple hives. Each year, identify your oldest frames, generally the darkest, and cross-reference against your marking system to be sure, and pull them from the brood chamber specifically during a period of decent nectar flow, when the colony has both the resources and the motivation to draw new comb quickly rather than leaving fresh foundations sitting untouched for weeks. Replace them with either new foundation or, for a slightly faster and more natural result, foundationless frames that let the colony build comb entirely to their own specifications, and give the colony that new frame positioned directly next to existing brood, rather than off at the edge of the box, since bees are considerably more motivated to draw comb adjacent to active brood-rearing activity than they are to invest effort in an isolated frame near the outer wall. There's a specific technique worth knowing here that dramatically improves how reliably bees actually draw out that new comb, rather than simply ignoring it in favor of already drawn old frames sitting right next to it. Checkerboarding, alternating a frame of new foundation between 2 frames of already drawn comb, rather than grouping several new frames together in one section of the box, takes advantage of the colony's own tendency to expand the brood nest outward from its existing center. A single new frame sandwiched between productive, already drawn neighbors gets pulled into that expansion naturally and drawn out relatively quickly, while a cluster of several new frames placed together, especially toward the edge of the box, can sit mostly untouched for a surprisingly long time, since there's no established brood activity immediately adjacent, pulling the colony's attention and resources toward it. It's worth budgeting for this as a genuine, recurring line item rather than a surprise cost, since a rotation system only works if you're actually replacing frames on schedule rather than skipping years because new foundation wasn't in the budget that particular season. Wax foundation typically runs somewhere around $2 to $3 per sheet, while plastic foundation, often coated with a thin layer of wax to encourage acceptance, runs a bit less per sheet, but carries a higher upfront cost if you're also buying the frame itself rather than just replacing foundation in an existing frame. For a colony running 10 frames in its brood chamber, rotating a third each year means replacing 3 to 4 frames annually, somewhere in the range of $10 to $20 a year, depending on which foundation style you choose. A genuinely modest ongoing cost once you compare it against the value of the colony's health and productivity it's protecting, especially set against the cost of a serious disease outbreak or a colony that quietly underperforms for years because nobody ever traced the cause back to comb age. Colonies also draw new comb noticeably faster when there's an active nectar flow, providing raw material for wax production. But during a dearth, when natural nectar is scarce, you can still encourage strong comb drawing by feeding a light sugar syrup specifically timed around the new frame's installation, giving the colony the carbohydrate resources it needs to produce wax, even when the environment outside isn't providing much on its own. This matters especially for beekeepers trying to catch up on a rotation that's fallen behind, since waiting exclusively for a strong natural flow before ever installing new foundation can push the whole project out by an entire season,
if that year's flow happens to be a weak one. Here's a mistake worth flagging, because a well-meaning beekeeper eager to get ahead of this problem can genuinely overcorrect and cause real harm to the colony in the process. Don't pull more than roughly a third of your brood frames in a single rotation cycle, even if you're catching up on years of neglect, and feel like you should replace everything at once. Removing too much drawn comb simultaneously forces the colony to spend an enormous amount of its available resources and worker hours on wax production, rather than on foraging, brood rearing, or the other tasks that actually keep the colony healthy and productive through the rest of the season. And a colony asked to draw out too much new comb too quickly can fall meaningfully behind on population growth and honey production for that entire year as a direct result. This is exactly why the standard guideline spreads rotation out across 3 to 5 years rather than compressing it into one aggressive cleanup. The gradual pace exists specifically to keep the colony's resource burden manageable throughout the process. There's an important distinction worth making here between brood comb and honey supercomb, because they don't need to be managed on the same timeline, and treating them identically wastes effort where it isn't actually needed. Brood comb accumulates the cocoon silk and pathogen reservoir buildup we've been discussing, specifically because brood is being raised in it repeatedly. That's the mechanism driving the whole problem. Honey supercomb, used purely for nectar storage and never for raising brood, doesn't go through that same cycle of larvae pupating and leaving cocoon residue behind, which means it can generally stay in productive service considerably longer than brood comb before the same concerns become relevant. Some beekeepers run honey superframes for a decade or more without rotation being a serious priority, reserving that more aggressive 3 to 5 year cycle specifically for the frames actually being used in the brood chamber where the real biological accumulation is happening. This whole conversation carries an extra layer of urgency for anyone acquiring secondhand equipment, which is genuinely common practice among beekeepers looking to save money getting started or expanding their operation. Used hive boxes and frames bought from another beekeeper, an estate sale, or a general marketplace listing come with an entirely unknown comb history. You have no way of knowing how many years that comb has actually been in continuous brood use, whether it came from a colony that ever had a disease event, or what treatments it may have been exposed to over its working life. Bringing that equipment directly into your own apiary without any inspection or precaution means potentially importing exactly the kind of hidden risk we've spent this whole video describing, fully formed and invisible, straight into a colony that otherwise had a clean history of its own. At minimum, any old, dark comb on secondhand frames is worth treating as an immediate rotation candidate rather than assumed safe equipment, regardless of how structurally sound it looks, precisely because you're missing the one piece of information, its actual age and disease history, that would tell you whether it's safe to keep in service at all. Here's something worth knowing if you're wondering what to actually do with the old comb you pull, because there's genuine value there beyond simply discarding it. Old dark wax can be rendered down through a solar wax melter or a simple double boiler setup at home, and while heavily used brood wax isn't typically suitable for candle making or cosmetic use at the same premium as fresh cappings wax due to the accumulated residue we've discussed, it still has value for things like fire starters, lubricating tools, or as a base for other non-food, non-skin contact applications. The rendering process itself is straightforward. Melt the old comb gently in water, well below a full boil. Let debris and impurities settle or strain out, and pour off the clean wax layer once it's cooled and separated from the water and leftover cocoon material sitting at the bottom. It's a genuinely satisfying way to close the loop on frames you're retiring, turning what could feel like pure waste into a usable byproduct, even if it's not destined for anything as premium as the honeycomb fresh wax pulled straight from a honey super. If a frame shows any signs of active disease rather than simply ordinary age-related darkening, that specific frame should be treated differently entirely. Burning is the standard, safe disposal method for anything suspected of carrying foul brood spores specifically, since the spore's extraordinary durability means ordinary rendering heat isn't reliably enough to neutralize the risk the way burning is. Here's the piece that actually resolves the tension this whole video opened with. The reason a frame that looks perfectly fine to casual inspection is exactly the frame serious beekeepers are quietly planning to retire. The entire risk profile of old comb is defined by things that don't show up in a normal visual check. Cell diameter narrowed by a few tenths of a millimeter per cycle. Pathogen spores sitting dormant and undetectable. None of it visible unless you're specifically measuring cell size or running a lab test for disease presence. A structurally intact, visually unremarkable frame of 5-year-old comb and a frame of fresh foundation look almost identical to a beekeeper doing a routine inspection, which is exactly why the bees don't seem to mind is such a persistently misleading signal here. The bees genuinely can't opt out of using degraded cells the way a beekeeper could choose to replace them. And a colony's outward productivity can mask this kind of slow, cumulative decline for years before it manifests as something visibly wrong, at which point you're managing a crisis rather than simply following a maintenance schedule that would have prevented it from ever becoming one. It's worth knowing the trade-off between wax foundation and foundationless frames, specifically in the context of rotation, since the choice affects both speed and long-term cell size in slightly different ways. Wax foundation comes pre-stamped with a hexagonal cell pattern, generally sized to a standard worker cell dimension, which guides bees to draw comb at a consistent, predictable size from the very start. Foundationless frames, using just a thin starter strip or no guide at all, let the colony build entirely to its own preference, which often means slightly larger natural cell sizes than standard foundation produces, along with a small amount of drone comb mixed in wherever the colony decides it wants some, both of which some beekeepers consider a genuine benefit for colony health and natural behavior. The trade-off is that foundationless comb can draw slightly less uniformly, occasionally producing comb that's less straightforward to inspect or extract from than the tidy, uniform rows a wax foundation sheet guides bees toward, so the choice often comes down to whether you value that natural variability or prefer the predictability of a guided pattern, rather than one option being straightforwardly better than the other for rotation purposes specifically. It's worth making this concrete with two beekeepers running otherwise similar operations, because the difference this single habit makes tends to be invisible right up until it isn't. Both start with new equipment the same spring, both manage mites conscientiously, both keep healthy, productive colonies through their first several years, with no apparent difference between them at all. One marks every frame with its installation year and rotates a third of the brood chamber annually without fail. The other simply keeps using the same frames indefinitely, since nothing ever looks wrong enough to prompt a change, and honestly, for the first 3 or 4 years, nothing does. Both apiaries look equally successful to an outside observer, and the beekeeper skipping rotation has no reason to think they're doing anything differently at all. By year 6, a regional disease outbreak sweeps through the area, hitting several apiaries with varying severity depending on their individual resilience going into it. The rotating beekeepers' colonies, running comb that's never more than 4 or 5 years old at the very oldest, weather it with only minor losses. The non-rotating beekeeper, running original frames that are now pushing 6 years of continuous, unbroken brood use, gets hit considerably harder, losing several colonies outright to an outbreak that traces back, at least in part, to exactly the kind of long-accumulated pathogen reservoir we've spent this whole video describing. Neither beekeeper did anything dramatically different in their day-to-day management. The entire gap between their outcomes traces back to one quiet habit, followed or skipped for 6 consecutive years before it ever visibly mattered at all. Let's lock in the big takeaways. First, dark comb isn't just cosmetically aged. Every brood cycle leaves cocoon silk behind that narrows cell diameter and can measurably shrink the bees raised in it over successive generations. Second, old comb functions as a long-term pathogen reservoir, capable of harboring disease spores for years or decades in a way that's completely invisible to ordinary visual inspection. Third, the practical fix is a gradual rotation system, replacing roughly a fifth to a third of your brood frames each year, checkerboarded next to active brood rather than clustered together, cycling through your entire brood chamber every 3 to 5 years without overwhelming the colony's resources in any single season. And fourth, secondhand equipment deserves extra scrutiny here specifically, since you have no way of verifying its actual comb age or disease history without treating dark, old-looking frames as an immediate rotation priority, regardless of how sound they otherwise appear. Tell me in the comments, how old is your oldest brood frame right now? And had you ever actually tracked that before watching this? I want to know how many beekeepers are running a genuine rotation system versus just using the same frames indefinitely until something forces a change. If this helped you think differently about equipment you assumed was simply fine because nothing looked wrong, the next video covers exactly how to read early, visible warning signs of disease in comb before it ever reaches the point of a full outbreak, the specific things worth looking for during a routine inspection that most beginners walk right past. Subscribe if you want it the moment it's up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. At the end of the day, so much of good beekeeping comes down to managing things on their actual biological timeline rather than your own convenience, treating for mites before symptoms show, checking mite counts before a colony visibly struggles, and yes, retiring comb before it quietly becomes a liability rather than waiting for it to announce the problem itself. None of this is glamorous work. Nobody posts an exciting video about swapping out a frame that looked completely fine. But it's exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous maintenance, done years ahead of when it visibly matters, that separates an apiary that sails through its 5th, 6th, 7th year from one that keeps running into problems nobody can quite explain. If you're starting this system today, here's the simplest version worth committing to right now. Grab whatever frames you can access this week, write "this year" on the top bar of every single one with a permanent marker, and do the same for every new frame you add going forward. That one small habit, kept up consistently, is the entire foundation this whole rotation system depends on. You can't manage comb age you never bothered to record, and 5 years from now, the beekeeper who started marking frames today will know exactly which ones are due, while everyone who skipped this step will be back to guessing based on color alone, exactly where we started. If you're running several hives, a simple notebook or spreadsheet listing each hive alongside its oldest and newest frame years takes the guesswork out of deciding which colony needs attention first during a given season. It doesn't need to be sophisticated. A single line per hive, updated once a year when you do your rotation pass, is genuinely enough to keep the whole system running smoothly across an apiary of any size, without needing to rely on memory or a fresh inspection of every single frame just to figure out where you left off the year before.